All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third of our six HCI Distinguished Lectures at the University of Chicago this fall. We're very pleased today to have Karahalios from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Karrie is a university scholar, professor of computer science at UIUC, co-director of the Center for People and Infrastructures and the Center for Just Infrastructures at UIUC, as well as a senior research scientist at Adobe Research. Karrie holds 4 different degrees from MIT, has been awarded things like a Sloan Research Fellowship, Career Award, Harvard Berkman Center for Internet and Society Fellowship, and much, much more. And we're excited so many of you are joining us today. Karrie is one of my research idols, and we're so happy that we've finally been able to get Karrie out to University of Chicago, even virtually. Why don't you just take it away, Karrie?
Wow, thank you, Blaise. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be speaking there. I don't know what the right word is to use. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and the University of Chicago was sort of like the place. And so I'll just get started. I'm going to talk today about some of the work of the students in our research group about algorithm awareness leading to algorithmic contestability. And so algorithms affect much of the content that we encounter online. As we can see in this older Google News interface, I kept asking on the left or on the right there, I kept moving sports to the left, but could not stop seeing sports articles. I was getting really confused. Moving to algorithms in the new Google interface, where now it shows me things that are for me, and I'm trying to figure out how they chose that they were for me, to algorithms that are showing us social news, what to buy, and more expensive things that we might buy, to what classes to take, to what styles we might wear, to what jobs and information we might be exposed to who we meet and date. And more, we're starting to see potential consequences of algorithmic curation and aggregation in the news. For example, on Twitter, algorithms select what is trending, and some researchers have argued that trending should be stopped as it suggests targets for misinformation. And there's other examples of misinformation online. And also, earlier in 2014, we saw Facebook's emotion contagion study that skewed what people saw online potentially, or scared people to think that it did. And more new research is suggesting that sensationalized and possibly false news stories percolate to the top of our feeds. And so awareness is one of the key elements here. People are often unaware. And when people are unaware and they find something that's unexpected, especially more recently the public at large, people become outraged. And so what I'm going to talk about today is awareness of curation and manipulation, how people behave around such acts, and designing for awareness and control. And I'm going to briefly start by visualizing awareness with an old study that we did 2014, 2015, using a narrative visualization around Facebook. And what we did here is we brought a bunch of people into the lab and we built a system that used their data. The work I'm showing you here is work by Motahari Islami, who just started at Carnegie Mellon University. And she built a tool called FeedViz that helped people see their newsfeed from a different light. So it had a content view and a friend view. On the left, in the content view, on the left column, you're seeing posts that everybody would send from your network. And on the right, only the things that appeared on your wall or on your what's called the news feed today. And so at first glance, this is where most people actually noticed that they weren't seeing everything in their feed. In fact, whatever is colored light blue is actually what you're seeing, and what's white is what you're not seeing. And they saw roughly 30%. On the right, what you're seeing is a column of people under the red bars where you saw none of their posts. In the middle, a column of blue bars where you see roughly half of their posts. And on the right, the green bars where you see all of their posts. And many users, like I said, had no idea that their newsfeed was prioritized and filtered. And instead, they inferred social important information, like a friendship not being close, because of this algorithm. We took it one step further and we gave them an interface where they actually could modify and rearrange whether the content that they saw and move it into the mostly seen or sometimes seen columns, and then also change posts that it's seen from people. And it's worth noting that participants in the study changed an average of 43% of their friends, signaling some desire for change and control. Moreover, people created folk theories by looking at these narrative visualizations. And while this talk, the folk theories, describing them in detail is out of the scope of this specific half-hour talk, there are two I want to put in particular. The personal engagement theory. Well, let me define folk theory first. They're non-authoritative conceptions of the world that develop among non-professionals and circulate informally. And the reason I'm pointing out these two, the personal engagement theory and the control panel theory, is because these were the only two that were actionable, where people could do something. The personal engagement theory, basically, the more interactions people had, like clicking like or commenting, something could affect change. For example, somebody would kept voting their own stuff or liking their own stuff, hoping that by liking it, it would appear in more people's feeds. Another example of a folk theory, the control panel theory that I mentioned, meant using the actual controls that you had there. And people were a little bit confused, like by hiding things, but they knew they could do it. They said, like, I've hidden things like this before, like the daily horoscope and things like that. So maybe that's why these types of things don't show up on my feed. And one could argue that these techniques and behaviors in the first setting, in the engagement setting, are a form of control, but it's more of an improvised control than I'm going to get to later in this talk. But control settings get even more complicated in the sense that even though there were controls, some were unaware that they reverted back to a default. If you move from top stories to most recent, it stays that way for a while, but goes back, most recent being reverse chronological, but always goes back to top stories. Moreover, you could snooze a post, you could hide a post, you could snooze somebody for 30 days. Like these control settings that have expirations or more complex behaviors were confusing, but they're popping up everywhere, including Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And many of these exist to increase user satisfaction, feelings of control, specifically around privacy, but also as a general mechanism to increase user engagement. But we realize that it's not clear that people can accomplish goals with them, or in some cases even find them. And do people even use such controls? And PhD candidate Silas Shu in our group decided to find out. So in a study that had an online component and an in-lab component, he started with an online survey where he asked people a bunch of questions. As an example, he asked, in the desktop version of Facebook, do you think a setting or group of settings exists to block a particular Facebook user from sending event invites to you? And it turns out, yes, this setting does exist. We asked people about 24 real control settings, like the one I just described, but we also made up 11 settings that did not exist. And we found that roughly 50% of participants performed no better than random at identifying which control settings existed. This included users who thought that real settings did not exist and users who thought that made up settings did exist. We had an in-lab component as well for more detail, and we asked people to complete 6 tasks that could be accomplished with a control setting, like imagine you wanted to make a close friend always appear first, or prioritize on your homepage newsfeed, prioritize a friend for your homepage newsfeed. All participants struggled to find the control setting for at least one task that we asked. However, just shortly after, in a guided tour of all the control settings in our session, 94% of the participants wanted to change at least one control setting. So there was at least a desire for control, but an inability to operationalize that desire, possibly because of the design. And design is critical here. We want to add one more point here in that we collected all the control settings that existed for Facebook, Twitter, and many other platforms, and there are a lot of them. In fact, Facebook had over 110 control settings. And in trying to explain on their site what these settings did, some explanations used over 140 words, and they were quite ambiguous. It wasn't clear what was going on. Moreover, related work highlights the importance of designing the right level of control. For example, there can be a paradox of choice, as we've seen in Iyengar's work. And because feelings of control are essential for human well-being, it can be demotivating not knowing what to do. And so in this work, we found that control settings offer desirable functionality, but users were not aware they existed. And even when they did, they couldn't find them. And so this led us to discover why they existed in the first place. And it gets even more complicated. Like I mentioned, algorithmically controlled settings that sometimes expire, like top stories or hide posts or see fewer posts like this. It can be really hard for users to validate whether they're even working. For example, if I went to Photoshop and made an image black and white, I could instantly see that I did it. But what if I said I wanted to see more like this? How do I know that it's working? And this plethora of settings and social media sites was popping up in more than one location on a site. Facebook, for example, had over 5 different places where they had control settings, and they were confusing. Could they be acting as placebos? We tried to find lots of existing literature on control settings, and we didn't find too much. Notably, Jeff Raskin's book on the humane interface and the Lewis and Riemann book on TCUID were amazing places to start. We found lots and lots of settings describing hardware settings like this and like this, but not so much on software. And Kristen Vaccaro decided to explore this further. To test this, Kristen Vaccaro, now an assistant professor at UCSD as of just a few weeks ago, built a tool that showed users their own Twitter newsfeed along with control settings for things like popularity in this case. I want to emphasize that a lot of the work that we do in the group involves building larger systems where people can see their own work in them. And we really want people to engage with the systems to increase ecological validity, look at their own actual data. And this is shown to improve the accuracy and quality of the data collected compared to self-reports, which most studies actually use. So she built this tool. It shows users their own feeds with control settings, but we deceived the users. We designed some of the control settings to intentionally malfunction. So what do I mean by that? We can say something is very, very popular, but instead what we did is we showed them a random subset of their tweets. We had several different control settings that we implemented for sentiment, closeness, frequency, popularity, celebrity. And these control settings were put on different feeds for different studies. For the online study, we looked at popularity and closeness. And what we did is we showed in random order people different interfaces, one that had the settings that were functional, one that had the settings that malfunctioned, and one with no control settings. And what did we find? We found that users were more satisfied with their news feeds when control settings were present compared to the no control settings condition, and that there was no statistically distinguishable difference between the functioning controls and the malfunctioning control settings. Now, this is huge, especially when people expect critical changes from these settings and sometimes even base their livelihoods on them. And as many of you probably read, Facebook was fined $5 billion recently because their control settings did not operate the way they were labeled, particularly in the cases of privacy. And this is not a new thing. We followed up this online study on Turk with an in-lab study where we built a variant of the system. And here you have these 5 control settings on the right and 2 feeds on the left. And we told people that there are 2 different algorithms for these control settings, but in reality, one of them was a malfunctioning feed and the other one functioned to the best of our ability. And we used this side-by-side feed to support reflection and action as users again engage with their own feeds. And what did people say about this? We assumed that everybody would figure out right away that one of the feeds was just not working. But instead, we found that people were blaming themselves and taking responsibility for cases that they saw there. One person basically said that I'm trying to imagine what the sliders do and thinking of how I've maybe created a conflicting environment, saying it was they're the ones that created this. In another case, a person said, probably if you're a sports fan, you would see this in the celebrities person, but I'm not really a sports fan. But then if somebody saw this picture, they would have known who this is, but I don't, using the celebrity slider. And finally, people took responsibility for actions they felt should be taken outside of the system. They're like, oh, these posts are still here. I should probably just unfollow these people so I don't see them, so that I don't like them so much. The other thing that we found that was pivotal, we thought, and was new to us, was that given all these issues with control settings, we studied how people actually got what they wanted out of them. And what we found was that people were using improvised functions, creating improvised practices. So for example, let's say somebody wanted to see a bunch of things, they would scroll down very quickly. Or for example, they would use tools like search in ways that weren't expected. Or in some cases, people were separating their friends on different platforms, like putting some work friends on one site, social friends on another site, basically to be able to manage their expectations because they couldn't do it otherwise. And I mentioned the online and the in-lab study. And I want to stress that we got similar findings in both. It was a mixed method study and our findings converged. But we really worried as we did this because, okay, maybe it was that our malfunctioning site was bad, but maybe our functioning site was just as bad. So at the end of the in-lab study, we debriefed our participants and we asked them to tell us which was a malfunctioning and which was the functioning feed. 28 of the 32 participants chose the correct feed as being the one that worked correctly. So for most people, the feeds were distinguishable, but only if you paid close attention to how they worked. And in typical use, the malfunction did not become evident to users. So what did we find here? The control settings can create a placebo effect. Users blamed themselves often and took responsibility. And users turned to improvisational, often impoverished approaches to see what they wanted on their feeds. So there's issues here with control setting design and users turning to these other forms to explore and experience control. We wanted to look at other forms of concerns that people had. And people were complaining about having posts removed. In this example, TikTok prevented disabled users' videos from showing up on feeds. They claimed to prevent them from being bullied. And so another form of control that people can take is the appeal. So Kristen Vaccaro, again, explored this as a second form of control, where you can go to sites, click on a link and, submit a form and say that, look, I have a problem here. However, past work found that when people do this, they feel like they're speaking into a void. And they find that beyond self-report, they really can't tell what's really happened. And so we, and by we, I mean Kristen, designed a study to explore different forms of appeals that can improve users' experience. And so she designed a between subject study that used a scenario where participants' Facebook accounts had been suspended for spreading misinformation. And in doing so, she offered 4 different approaches for appeal. And she wanted to test which one of them brought people more satisfaction. There was the no appeal condition, the written appeal condition where a human replied, the written appeal condition where an algorithm replied, and the behavioral condition where you promise to change your behavior and be good for the next week. And if you are, you'll be able to get your account back. And so we asked, how does adding appeals change users' perceptions of fact? And by fact, I mean fairness, accountability, and feelings of control and trustworthiness in an algorithmic decision-making system. And what did we find? We found that despite the existence of this mechanism for control, users did not find the existing appeal process fair, trustworthy, or accountable, nor the small variance of that appeals process that we introduced into the system in our attempts to improve it. And while none of the differences were statistically significant, it was in fact the no appeal condition that users thought to be most trustworthy, accountable, and so on. This suggests that current appeal processes do not meet users' expectations. One person said that Facebook banned me for this very thing because they said that the money in the board game I was trying to sell was counterfeit. It was monopoly money. It's not supposed to be real money. Basically, they were claiming that they disagreed with the automated process because they couldn't understand the subtle nuances and adapt to different circumstances. Another example, another theme that emerged was opacity and inconsistency. A subject said, is it inconsistent, arbitrary, and never ever explained properly or understandably to the user? They do what they want when they want. Another user claimed that they were unaware of the misuse of the account, and if suspicion is lifted, they will use caution in future posts. They said, I have never knowingly misled anyone, and they began using virtue ethics and describing that they're not the kind of person that does this or the type of person who would ever share misinformation. What they really wanted was they wanted someone to provide context, not just about the post itself and why it was deleted, but instead provide context about themselves. And so other people went so far as to say goodbye to the site. I would get off Facebook because it's harder to prove it's not true than it is to try to fight it. And at the end of the day, Facebook does what it wants. It would let people to state that they would leave the system, in part because they don't think they have control over the decisions. And that's this feeling of helplessness and learned helplessness that we've seen throughout a series of our studies. And I mentioned impoverished control, meaning that despite there's a variety and volume of existing mechanisms for control on social media, they fail to address users' needs. And out of these projects, this was a really big critical element that we found that led us to think about other forms of control that might offer less impoverished methods for control. And we looked at contestability. this ability for users to ensure that users' voice is being heard by designing for it. And by contestability, we are very much inspired by the work of Tad Hirsch and Klutz and Mulligan. And they define contestability as a set of mechanisms for users to understand, construct, shape, and challenge models' predictions. Basically, a set of mechanisms for users to understand. And to highlight this with a scenario, in 2015, in an example that had no contestability, Facebook was suspending Native Americans' names over the real name policy. For example, if your last name was Lone Hill or Brown Eyes, your account was suspended. And they would say your account has been temporarily suspended because it looks like you're not using your real name. Facebook is a community where people use their real identities. We require everyone to provide their full name so you always know who you're connecting with. Don't worry, you'll be able to get back into your timeline with your full real name. If you're using a nickname, you can always add it back into your account as an alternate name. And people were upset. Lance Brown Eyes stated, they let me change my name back, but what about you and all the others they discriminated against? Our people need to know they can fight back. The more of us stand up, they will change. But how can you do this? And he described his experience. But in this case, they were eventually able to persuade Facebook to change the decision-making process by turning to the press and exerting pressure that way. And that's not built into the system of contestability, but it was their own form of contestability that they used through outside infrastructures. And so we wanted to start exploring this. So we ran a workshop because there were so few systems designed for contestability. It's a new approach. And we wanted to increase knowledge of it. We wanted to spread the word. So with several co-organizers, we ran a CSCW workshop. We had participants come from around the globe to discuss the potential of and challenges in designing for contestability. And the outcome grew into a study that was again led by Kristen Vaccaro of a series of participatory design workshops where groups shared how they would design systems for social media content moderation. And in this series of workshops, we had 3 groups. Unlike our previous study, we did not recruit subjects that represented our population. In this case, we explicitly recruited participants in 3 marginalized groups, LGBTIQ+ communities, racial minorities, and artists. And we recruited participants from these groups that have been traditionally marginalized, but because all of them had been negatively impacted by content moderation decisions in the past. And so each group was given a case study that featured an experience of someone from the group that encountered problems with content moderation. As an example, we shared an experience by Betty Tompkins. She's an American painter known for her feminist art. And earlier this year, she had her Instagram account deleted after she posted a layout from an exhibition catalog that included a black and white reproduction of one of her paintings that is based on pornography and is showcased in the collection of Paris' Center Pompidou. Tompkins said in a statement that because of Instagram's major role in the art world, its current guidelines are prohibitive to artists whose work is challenging or thought-provoking. And she said, this is our job as artists to break the rules. That's what makes it art. It doesn't conform. So the participants were presented with the current policies on the platform and were presented with other reasons why these cases have happened. And this is caused public outright from artists far and wide. And they fundamentally disagree with the idea of removing content because it contains nudity, for an example. They argue it inhibits artistic freedom. Others argue that it has a chilling effect. It changes the art that artists create to make sure they can share their work without being banned. And then they finally heard about related issues that have emerged, for example, those who use Instagram to find work, those who take issue with its role in defining decency, like Aboriginal women. And so there were 4 components to the participatory design study, and it was very much influenced by the book, The Convivial Toolbox. There was a report card section where people refilled report cards to elicit values that they thought were important for designing and evaluating content moderation systems. The second, the pros and cons, were for structuring brainstorming activities, thinking of the pros and cons of different ways to provide feedback with the goal of helping users think beyond what currently exists. And then we had these magical mugs, the idea being that people could envision whatever they wanted this mug to do to help them design the system to allow them to shape and control a moderation system in any way that they chose. And finally, some ways for them to actually operationalize the designs and how they would actually make them come to be. And Kristen ran 9 of these workshops. I'm so in awe of what she did, 3 for each of these 3 groups, and they each ran for about 2 hours. And I want to state that she ran these during COVID in unexpected circumstances and had to switch and run these online and encountered many challenges, but really pulled through and got, I think, fascinating findings. From the report cards, there were interesting results in terms of the values. And the findings, the interviews were transcribed and coded. And basically, 4 clusters emerged according to the number of distinct participants who contributed to them. And these 4 clusters were inclusivity, competence, communication, and equality. However, the participants had many different values they thought were important, many of which appeared in the designs. In the Magical Mug study, several different themes emerged there. What would people change, for example? In the analysis here, in the closing discussions, we used an iterative open coding process to identify the common themes. And while there were others, the main ones were representation, argumentation, cultural competence, compassion, and access. And so for representation, participants shared many ways of achieving this. And there was lots of sketching exercises using online sketching tools in this workshop. People believe there should be some sort of focus group or a board or a randomly selected jury or vote to establish norms and policies of content moderation on the site. One example a participant suggested was randomly select 10 people, or why not 1,000 people? There's so many people on Facebook. And ask them, should this be allowed on Facebook? Or maybe people can run for being on a board, and there's some way that people can be elected to a group or have a kind of process and help set the standards, but also a place to bring disputes about the content. Others were critical of this approach and saying that, well, majority rules may not be the best way to go about this. And while we want diversity, just because the majority agrees with something doesn't mean it's right. I know there's some things in the past that a majority have agreed, and it's now in the present day morally unopposable. And so there were drawbacks there. The second theme was argumentation. This idea that something should exist where people could have this type of persuasion. Somebody said, I do find a lot of value in referring to what the community wants. Democracy came up quite a bit, the democracy aspect of this, but obviously lots of flagging is incorrect or not reasonable. So the rest of it is we need people who are informed about the different aspects and are sympathetic to them, both sides. Is actually going to listen to an argument, and is an argument presented is the argument presented a reasonable one? And the issue of power came up quite a bit. And while everyone understood that obviously talking to a mug and arguing with is not realistic, it could also find a way to help you say things like you're going to try to fight back against it, and really opened up people's minds about ways of being creative and using speculative design in ways they hadn't imagined before. And the power ideas came up quite a bit, with several people arguing this is a way to equalize the differences in education, time, access, and so on. And that there's always a possibility of changing something if you have enough resources, if you have enough money, and if you, I guess, have the argumentative powers to make it happen. Cultural competence was the next theme, the third one. And the data for this experiment was collected, I should say, during the Black Lives Matter protests in early 2020. And one participant shared how the videos that did contain violence were important, but could be moderated. They argued that most of us would have known nothing about George Floyd had it not been for the social media groups, and look how that turned about. So that's what I said. I don't silence the voices of the oppressed. One of the beautiful things about oppressed groups is you use what's available to try to make the difference in your situation. And they were arguing that somebody in a different country, whether it be China or India or elsewhere, having the power to mute that should not be possible because it serves as a double injury for that particular situation. And others agreed, sharing that this requires knowledge of more specific communities, American culture, which is completely different from Black culture, which is different from Spanish American culture, which is completely different from so many other cultures, and that intersectional identities make it even harder for someone who has not lived their experiences to dictate what is or is not appropriate to share. Participants suggested that platforms could connect users to their own communities to weigh in on what is or is not acceptable. The same participant suggested that a Council of Peers app emerge where limited online currency could be spent to advocate for a friend's post. Maybe they might say, hey, you shouldn't be talking like that on the platform. It's nice when your friends check you in that way. And again, compassion came up a lot, and that is the next theme. It was one of the most common themes, the idea being that we need to emphasize sympathy when making decisions, provide emotional and particularly mental health support, and finally, connect users impacted by content moderation to their family and or community through mental support. They argued that it doesn't end with, okay, you reported it, they violated their code, we're taking it down, that's just the first step. There needs to be more, and needs to be channels to help people, possibly through virtual therapy sessions, or just even like more videos or content that's tailored with like, how do you process what you're feeling? A lot of discussions about money and how about profit should not be the way these businesses are run, the possibility of changing some of these corporate structures and the platform incentives, and how they might be creating toxic environments. And lastly, access. They talked for more direct access with the people actually making these decisions, the content moderators, so that they could actually have the ability to shape and influence the policies and the moderators themselves. Many introduced designs that would allow the user to communicate directly with the human content moderators, but others went further, arguing for access to the power brokers. Somebody said you could pour your problems and worries into the mug, and once you add them to the mug, you'd watch them heat up and all of your worries would evaporate, but they would get to the Instagram powers that be, and it would fill up their mug instead of yours. Another participant agreed, and themes emerged on collective access, meaning that I feel like many people, they don't know that they often get bullied, and definitely when they're facing up corporations or something like this, where you feel like you're just one user, but that together, people coming together could create real change. And so in terms of conclusions from this work, one of the things that many people have been stating, but that Jenna Burrell summarized very nicely, is that this area of concern about user agency and control has received relatively less emphasis in emerging scholarship. In fact, discussions of algorithmic fairness seem to often tack in the opposite direction of compassion and access and people towards developing tools that better mediate the fair allocation of resources based on expert definitions and new forms of technical validation in the form of new algorithms. And so she summarizes well, and many other people have been exploring this area. And we all agree that this idea of looking at the people perspective has not received enough attention. So returning a little bit to the beginning, there's many, many challenges here. And we need to think about how to design systems so that users do feel a sense of agency and control. So how might we do that moving forward? One is to design for algorithm awareness, embed signals in interfaces, include intermittent reveals to allow for comparison, have easier to find controls, better explain subjective controls, and all this to help people make sense and appropriate these tools for their own use. Very often people use terms like I'm manipulating the manipulation. Another approach is through these augmented control setting designs, visualizations, or even interventions or mechanisms for algorithmic literacy that can improve users' sense of control and agency. We introduced the concept of impoverished control. And what would happen if, rather than using the hundreds of available control settings, would it be possible for us to design social media systems specifically to address these improvisational approaches? And I'm not arguing that they're bad. I often feel good just scrolling down a screen. There could be value in scrolling quickly, but then why not explore controls that can be used instead of having over 140 that are not used? And also, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the amazing work of Ben Grosser. This is one of his art pieces, The Endless Doom Scroller. But this idea of affecting control over this type of experience that you might see daily is something that many people express a desire for in many of our studies over the last 7 or so years. And finally, we've seen this shift towards more value-driven controls and using values and this contestability to surface reasoning that would happen and ethics in the system. And how do we embed this into the system for argumentation and access? And we hope to see more work in this area so that we see less articles like this in the future. And I'm going to end here, and apologies for talking so quickly, but I want to thank all of the amazing PhD students that led this work that I described today, Motahari, Silas, and Kristen, and all of the amazing students and faculty that collaborated with us in the process. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. I'm very sorry. But there's many, many people over the years that led to this work. I want to conclude by saying thank you and to leave some time for questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Karrie. That was an amazing talk. And we have time, about 20 minutes actually, for questions. And we can take questions either in the Zoom chat if you're on Zoom, or in the YouTube chat if you're watching on YouTube. Right. And as we wait for questions to roll in, I'll get us started off with one actually. So, Karrie, I thought it was, when you were talking about work from Kristen and others about essentially control as a placebo for users, I was starting to wonder to what degree control might serve as a placebo or perhaps sedative for regulators. That, if people, you don't need to regulate us because there is a control for that. It's incumbent on the users to exercise that control.
Yeah, I think that this idea of like shifting responsibility, can make it easier. In some cases, say, look, it's not me, it's you. And there have been some themes and some papers in this area. This idea of, regulation comes up a lot. And there's many people arguing for regulation in this space, from regular users to sometimes the platforms themselves to the government. One interesting parallel is the credit scoring system. And so, oftentimes in my classes and when I give talks, that I can't do this right now because I can't see any faces, I'm sorry, but I often ask people how many have actually tried to contest their credit score. I've started the process, but never got very far. And all of my questions of I must have asked hundreds of people if anyone ever managed to contest their credit score. Because basically, the burden is on you, right? I have to go and do this. I have to contest it. And the only time I managed to find one person who contested it successfully was when their name was mixed up with somebody else's. And there was it was like a naming issue. Not so much I bought this or I didn't buy that, or I had this credit card or I had that credit card. And so again, it was like speaking to the void, and people couldn't do it. But the platform said, look, we offer this channel for you to contest. I would just really like to find somebody who's used it. What's really also interesting with the credit scoring system is that in many ways, the audience for that platform to contest isn't us, the users, but it's the regulators. And it keeps the regulators at bay. And so I think your point is spot on. And I guess the big question is, how do we move from that so that people can actually have sort of this equal power on the platform and be able to help shape it for what they need, but in a way that's befitting a democratic society. And, when we first started this work in 2012 with bias and algorithms, the word democratic didn't pop up enough. It was more about the power of algorithms, but more and more over the last few years, this idea of digital democracy, or what does it mean to have a democratic system online, keeps becoming a prevalent theme in ours and others' work.
Great, thanks. We have a couple questions queued up. We have one from Will, who's a PhD student in our department, who asks whether you could comment on how contestability might interact with recent efforts to fight disinformation on these platforms, such as slowing down proliferation of content, shadow bans, and things like that.
Yeah, that is a great question. So operationalizing contestability, I would argue, is very, very task specific, at least in our exploration so far, because a lot of these tasks, are very, very challenging. And there's been some attempts by us and others to explore them. And some approaches actually involve having committees of experts, very similar actually to what many of our subjects, our participants rather, in our studies came to suggest. But for example, like what would happen if you had like a quick group of people that included, an ethicist, that included, let's say an example of, do we want to, or an example of, let's say we're in a humanitarian relief effort and we have one drone, but we can make 4 stops. Like, what is the order that we make these stops? How might you actually have a human on the loop system, a human in the loop system? And how would you have like a group of experts there on the spot, whether like have an ethicist, have somebody that's an expert in humanitarian efforts, have somebody who's an expert in the local culture and understands the norms, somebody that knows the political consequences in that space, and have them help in making decisions very, very quickly. Now, this isn't going to make a split-second decision, but it could guide you in the right direction to make the decisions that you need to make. In terms of misinformation, this is really, really hard. And I wish I could give you like a black and white answer right now, but I don't have it. And one reason is that a lot of this is changing on the fly. Like earlier in discussions with folks today in our group over many, many months now, we've been discussing, posts on our coronavirus subreddit, where something that might, at t=0, be considered sound, like sound information, but at t=10 and t=20 might not be accurate information anymore. And we're living in a time where it's hard to know the entire history of something. And the best we can do is use the knowledge that we have at the moment and make the best decisions for the moment at hand. And that's where a lot of the work is focusing on at the moment. And so I think that addresses the beginning part of your question, but I don't know the answer to your full question.
Right, yeah, I definitely agree, Karrie. That was a great question and great answer. The next one we have queued up is from Konstantinos, another student in our department, who reports that in many large Facebook groups, one of the informal rules is report posts to the moderators rather than getting the group zucked, is the term Konstantinos uses. So I assume that means informal. Use kind of these informal mechanisms rather than maybe using the platform's built-in mechanism, or And so, how does this fit into your research?
And so I haven't explored this in much detail, but there are other amazing researchers like Ishwar. I'm going to butcher his last name, so I'm going to cheat and not say it. But he's actually been studying exactly, harassment and trolling on sites like Reddit. And there's been many, many homegrown efforts on Reddit to address misinformation, also attempts at policy. And one of the things that I want to stress is that, policy with the help of setting new social norms is going to be critical here. And it's important for them to go hand in hand and to see how some of the studies that we've and others done could help inform new policies. But there is lots of work going on right now that actually help moderators, because like Konstantinos mentioned, moderators get a lot of these requests and they can get overwhelmed. And so some of Ishwar's tools, for example, help percolate some of the big cases to moderators. And actually, in some cases, they bring cases to moderators that they wouldn't have seen otherwise. And so I would refer people to work in that domain for algorithmic human-in-the-loop systems to help with content moderation on Reddit.
Great. Next question is from Galen, who, harkening back to some of the previous discussion, is wondering to what extent you think meaningful contestability, at least vis-a-vis Facebook or Twitter, might impact those companies' business models.
That's an excellent question. It would require a lot more, a bigger labor force. And it would require training of a big labor force and hopefully, wages that reflect the intensity of the work. It's challenging to say because many companies, hire people to be moderators. And we do know of the challenges in some of that work. And we also know that we often don't want people who are marginalized to be the ones doing extra work when it comes to sort of, other types of sourcing infrastructures. But this idea of improved help systems is at the core of HCI. Some of the work by John Carroll has just been incredible in this respect. And I think it needs to come back in this new domain, this idea that if we can't help people recover from these challenges or from not being able to use the system because of flawed algorithmic systems or even flawed people-based systems, they are going to, slowly fall apart. And so this idea of creating new teams for help that are engaged with people, but that also have, the right support, is something that I think is important in companies. In terms of models and business models, I mean, a lot of what came up, and I can speculate, but what came up in our work a lot was this idea of, what would happen if we moved away from having, S corps? What would happen if people explored B corps, like Kickstarter, for example? What would happen if we moved away from advertising or changed advertising such that there was a different power balance there? But advertising and power came up a lot, as did this idea of, having to, make boards happy and make shareholders happy. And these are hard things to change, but there are some companies that are looking at it. And many of these issues did come up in the participatory design, in the 3 groups that we met with.
And very relevant to the things you were just mentioning, Karrie. We have a question from Theo, who actually, starts with an observation that the idea of impoverished control really seems to be at the heart of the problem in social media environments. But then in many ways, this issue seems to resemble power dynamics of employers to employees. And, Theo notes that social media is a bit different since the user is both the consumer and the product being sold. Nonetheless, Theo asks, do you see a feasible role for consumer unions, guilds, or third-party data brokers rearranging certain power imbalances between the consumer and social media companies?
So that's a great question, Theo. We've been exploring that. It's hard to do as an academic. And I have to say, I've also been scared by some infrastructures I've seen posted by banks to do exactly this, in a sense, to trade like options and futures on our data in the process. And so I think there's glimpses of this happening. And I wish I had more power to influence it in some ways, going back to the power dynamic. But maybe one thing we could do as researchers is, help guide the way. And I'm hoping that many of the students watching this talk will be the ones that can, press further than I have, and that, members of our group have. But there are glimpses of these third-party infrastructures popping up, and some of them might have their own different incentive models, which we would need to interrogate as well. And a lot of this also leads to another area of work that we've been working on extensively over the last few years in terms of auditing that was out of the scope of this specific talk. But it's almost like every time you create some new infrastructure for something, you tend to breed some new form of inequality. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm saying we should do it, but interrogate it in the process, and have many of the audience members that are affected be involved in the process, and have it be less opaque.
Great. Yes, we at the moment have gone through the questions in the chat. And again, if you have more questions, please put them either in the Zoom chat or ask them on YouTube. I'm monitoring both. But in the meantime, actually, I have another question for you, Karrie, from myself, which, when we think about kind of algorithms and how they're used in systems that interact with humans, you've done such pioneering work on social media where we're interacting with algorithms over and over again. And so you see your Facebook newsfeed and the algorithm, queues up some content, queues up some more content. You'll come back the next day, it's queued up more. And so you have, essentially this continuous process of interacting with an algorithm. But of course, some of the, issues about kind of algorithmic fairness have come up in the context of, well, the algorithm's making one decision that impacts you. And so I'm kind of curious how you think about kind of impoverished control or improved control, impoverished transparency, improved transparency based on how frequently you're interacting with the algorithm.
So that's interesting in the sense that we found that people that interacted more with the algorithms had more folk theories of how the algorithms would work. And so one of the things that we had hoped would be that with some of our interventions, we've designed like 3-4 reveal systems so far, FeedViz being the first one. What we found is that by exposing people to these in a short matter of time, it was practically the equivalent of having been on the platform as much as like a super user. And so I think there's something fascinating about creating tools like this. Now, where you would place them and how you'd get people to use them, I mean, that's a different story. But if people were motivated to sort of like create, a bunch of folk theories quickly, and I think there are ways we could implement this because people do like to discover things about themselves and compare themselves to other people. And just to discover insights about what's going on in their social media feeds. I think there's something interesting there about providing augmented controls that exist either outside of a system or parallel to the system that could help you gain insight into how a system works. Now, to date, we've built a lot of these systems from the outside, meaning we haven't had access to like the internal data of the company, and we're limited by what certain APIs allow us, because we've tried really hard, not to violate terms of service as much as we can. But I do think there's so much promise in these systems, and we found that when we created them, they were used in art classes, in iSchools, in CS departments, in the US and abroad. And then when Facebook stopped their API 1.0 and the system died, we had many people ask us to re-implement the system via scraping, and we decided not to do that because we didn't want to violate the terms. But there was something interesting about the demand for the tools, not only used in courses, but in terms of algorithm literacy, in terms of understanding for yourself what's going on and what would happen if you like reuse this tool today and reuse it 3 months from now, and then 3 months from then, and 3 months from then to see the changes that happened. That's what was interesting about the tools. And I would be really excited to create more of them with the right access to like levers to enter the systems from the outside.
So we actually do have another question queued up, but I have a direct follow-up to that, which is, I don't know if you saw, but it made the round in news stories this weekend that Damon McCoy at NYU has this project on political ad transparency, where basically people volunteer with, they use a plugin he and his team have built, and they basically share political ads they're seeing on Facebook with them. And the researchers received a cease and desist order from Facebook. And so, and as you're mentioning kind of like how you as a researcher plug into a platform, kind of like aspirationally, what would be the ideal mechanism you see for this kind of researcher industry collaboration moving forward?
So that's a hard one because, there are some channels for collaborators, from academia to work with researchers, but many have argued that, there's, unfair access as well. One of the things that, one approach that we've taken is to move outside of academia, and with colleagues, Christian Sundvig, Crystal Wilson, Ellen Mislov, the amazing ACLU, and a media company, we sued the US government for the right to be able to scrape certain forms of data and to create sock puppets to create these algorithm audits for the purposes of discrimination. And so that was, we've done a lot of work in this area, but we sort of went out of our comfort zone there to try to be able to legally get some of this data. So I'm in full support of the NYU researchers. I think what they're doing is amazing. And I think it's so important and so timely. And so I hope that, there's pressure from the press and the public that we do more of this. In terms of audits, in housing, there's mandates that we do audits for housing, at certain intervals. And so maybe that's one way of doing it. Now, who gets to do it and who's designated as an official auditor, that's, that would take a longer discussion. But I do think that work is so important and needs to happen.
Great. Yeah, no, I fully agree with you on that one. We have a lightning question for you, since we have about 2 minutes left. Will has a follow-up question from before. When you were mentioning how moderation can be psychologically challenging for the human beings who are the moderators, do you see any potential for lessons from crowdsourcing literature and like the literature on how humans label data to help mitigate some of those concerns about the psychological challenges or the burnout or just how difficult that is?
I mean, even before like labeling and adding more crowdsourcing, I really would argue that people need to be provided with support and fewer hours with more pay. Amy Zhang has done some amazing work with her colleagues on, friend sourcing for email. That only goes so far before you can use up a lot of your social capital. And these feeds are never ending. And so I think that, we really, really need, expert help for people that do this. And we shouldn't just, people need benefits who do this. People need the right support, just like the people in our studies, in our workshops, who said that, it's not enough just to report something that's been troubling you as a user of these systems, but to have some follow-up to support you. I would argue that the moderators need that as well.
Great, and that's let's on that note, thank Karrie again for an amazing talk and just an amazing body of work so far and so much exciting stuff to come. And for those of you who are joining in for the first time, we actually had over 60 people today between the YouTube and Zoom streams at a time, and so that was really great to see. And we're basically taking this opportunity this fall to bring a bunch of HCI luminaries to campus. This was the third of 6 distinguished HCI lectures. So we started off with Chris Harrison from CMU, that then had Anand Day from University of Washington. Today, Karahalios from UIUC. We'll be continuing on in the coming weeks with Tanzim Chowdhury from Cornell, with Amy Ogun from CMU, and concluding with Hiroshi Ishii from MIT's Media Lab. So it's some of our idols, and a really great way to celebrate the growth of HCI at the University of Chicago, where a couple of years ago, I believe actually up until about 2017, there had never been, as far as I can tell, a Chi paper with University of Chicago authors, at least through my amateur sleuthing. And now we've grown tremendously, and so happy to be able to welcome people like Karrie to campus. And thank you again so much, Karrie, for coming and giving an amazing talk, and for earlier today meeting with some of our faculty. Subsequently, we will be meeting with some of our students. And thanks to all the attendees. Right, and so we'll hope to see you again.